couple of months ago, I taught a really amazing live class that was all about my favorite revolutionary practice method called the Post-it method. I love this method because it works for any level of piano player and any piece, period. You can use it in the beginning stages of learning a piece to learn things correctly from the ground up so that you don't have to spend time later going back to fix mistakes. You can use it to troubleshoot spots in your music where you know there's tons of mistakes, but you're not quite sure why. And then once you find where those mistakes are and what's causing them, you can use the Post-it method to fix them for good so that they don't keep causing issues in your playing. So I wanted to throw this live class up here as a tutorial for you because there was such amazing content. Now I've clipped out all of the extra fluff so that you just have all of the gold here in this tutorial. Here it is. And I'm going to tell you first of all, why it works, and then I'm gonna show you how to use it, and I'm gonna give you examples of where you can use it to get the most benefit. So I'm gonna take you through a couple of different scenarios. I'll take you through using the Post-it method in the beginning stages of a piece, like when you're learning it. I'll take you through troubleshooting some problems and some ways that you can do that. And I'll take you through fixing mistakes, and then I'm gonna give you a couple of like bonus ideas on how to use the Post-it method. The coolest thing about these revolutionary practice methods that I talk about is that they often have many uses and they can solve many problems if you know how to take the method and kind of, work it into different scenarios where you can use it to your advantage. The way that the Post-it method works is you've got your handy dandy stack of Post-its that you keep by your piano, by your keyboard so that they're always there. And let's say you want to either learn this piece or you're troubleshooting a problem or you need to, fix a mistake that's been like ingrained into your memory. The way that you do it is that you use your Post-it and you actually cover up parts of the music. So for example, if I was starting to learn this piece, I would maybe put my Post-it after the first 2 beats. Okay, and I know that's a small section of music, 2 beats. We're gonna focus in on those 2 beats and we would just practice those 2 beats. I can also use my Post-it to start in different sections of the measure or different sections in the phrase. If I use 2 Post-its and I can cover up, a lot of music and really just focus in on the middle of a measure or the middle of a phrase. The reason that the Post-it method works so well, first of all, it's really psychologically helpful to have the physical Post-it there. And so I have tons of students that, I've taught this method to, and then they go home to practice and they're like, oh, I did the Post-it method, but I didn't have Post-its. So I just kind of like made a mental note to myself that I was just going to work on the first 2 notes. It doesn't work. It doesn't work at all because I know that most of you here watching are like me. And when you sit down to practice, you're like, okay, I have the best intentions. I'm only going to focus on this section of the music. And then you get started and maybe it sounds kind of good after a few repetitions and you're feeling inspired. And so you just keep going. And before you know it, you've played the whole entire piece and you completely lost sight of your goal, which was to only focus on a small section. So the Post-its are there. They actually prevent you from seeing to what comes next. And so it's really, really important that you actually use the Post-its. A couple of other reasons that this method works so well is because 1, it forces you to go a little bit slow. When we look at a piece of music and there's tons of notes and we're kind of like, oh my gosh, there's so much going on here. It's counterintuitive, but the natural instinct and the natural inclination is actually to like try to kind of rush through it because we're frantically looking at all of it and maybe it's a little bit stressful to see all of it or a little bit overwhelming. And so we start to push ourselves to go faster. Maybe you know what the song is supposed to sound like and you want to get it there. And so we just rush through things. And it's kind of funny because when we put the Post-it there and we force ourselves to focus in on a really small section of music, all of a sudden that pressure to get everything to sound like the song goes away. The pressure to get the whole page or to get the whole song isn't there anymore because you've changed the goal. You're working on 2 beats or 1 measure or whatever, size of chunk you've decided to work on. It completely changes the goal, which changes how you approach it. It helps us stay really focused because, there is that actual physical barrier and you can't see what comes next in the music. And so it takes the choice out of it, which is really helpful because I know that all of you here are go-getters. You're amazing. You're like watching live streams, watching tutorials, really figuring out how to be the most beautiful piano player that you can be. And we all have the best of intentions, but that doesn't mean that we don't do things that don't help us in our practice. It also forces you to stay organized because when you are using a system like a Post-it note and you're like, working on 2 notes and then you move the Post-it note 1 note and then you move the Post-it note 1 note. You're being really organized. You don't have a choice but to notice like how things are sounding. And when things start to go wrong,
it's really obvious where they're going wrong because you're focusing on 1 or 2 or 3 beats at a time. So you know exactly where the mistakes are happening. So it brings a level of organization that just doesn't exist without it. It also makes your brain think about things in a different way because you can start at different points in the music. And this is one of the most highly underutilized ways of practicing, is making yourself start not at the beginning. Oftentimes we start at the beginning of the piece, or we'll start at the beginning of a line or the beginning of a phrase. But you can get things so much deeper into the other layers of your memory when you force yourself to start in the middle of a measure, or when you force yourself to start in the middle of a phrase. But it's hard to do because visually, our brains, we like to organize things and we like to make sense of things. And so when we're looking at a piece of music and we say, okay, I'm gonna start in the middle of this phrase, it can actually just visually be very confusing to do that. And the hurdle that you have to jump over to be able to start in the middle of the phrase can be so large that it can kind of make you give up. But when we have the Post-its there and we can cover up the notes, it makes it more simple. It makes it way easier to look at and for our brains to understand and to be able to focus in and start in the middle of a measure or in the middle of a section. We're gonna talk first about how to use the Post-it method for learning a piece. And this is my favorite way to use it because if you're starting a new piece and you can lay a really solid foundation by going slow and focusing on accuracy, you won't learn mistakes. It seems obvious when I say it like that, but not many people approach their practice that way. If we go slow, if we make smaller goals, if we focus on accuracy as the main goal, then you don't learn mistakes and you don't have things later down the road that you have to go back and fix. And that's pretty powerful. And that's usually one of the big first things that happen when people start working with me is we dive into a new piece and they start to see oh, if I just take the time to be a little organized, if I take the time to bring, that mindfulness to it, it saves me so much time and effort later. And that's what the Post-it method can do in these early stages. So what you would do, I'm gonna go back to this slide that I had up before, is you would use the Post-it method and you can start at the beginning of your piece. And I would say you can start with a couple of notes or a couple of beats at a time. This is not necessarily the first time you've ever looked at the piece, because in order for the Post-it method to work, we have to be consistent. So that means that we have to know our fingering, so we're using the same finger numbers every time, and we have to have a sense of the rhythm and the counting out loud. If you're not being consistent and you're not counting out loud with the Post-it method, it won't work. And I want to just explain why, because this has come up a lot in questions in the past couple of weeks. So when we do these practice methods that I talk about all the time, these revolutionary practice methods, what we're doing is it's kind of like we're taking a puzzle and we're taking individual pieces of the puzzle and we're looking at them and we're examining them and we're learning them in a really deep way. And then we're putting those puzzle pieces back on the board. But we need some sort of consistency and structure, because if we take the Post-its and we just start randomly practicing random sections of the music and we're not counting and we're not using the same fingers, it's chaos and we're not helping ourselves. We're really wasting our time. But if we're making sure that when we use the Post-it method, we're using the same fingers and we're counting out loud, we're giving our brains the same information every single time. And so it doesn't matter if we mix up that information. And in fact, it actually makes our brains stronger if we are doing it the same way every time and we mix up the information and we force our brains to go in a different order and we force our brain to work on different lengths or different sections of music. That works really well and it gets it deep into our memory. But we have to have that consistency. So we have to have the same fingers that we're using every time, and we also have to have the counting out loud because that provides the structure. So when you're learning a piece, you've already gone through and you've decided on some fingering, and you've also already gone through and you've either written in your counting or you've maybe clapped and tapped and counted it out loud. And then we come to the Post-it method. And the Post-it method is great because it's gonna get things hands together into your muscle memory much faster than if you were to just sit down and play through the piece over and over and over again. So what we do in this beginning stage is we choose a section. We can start at the beginning since we're early on in the learning process, and we pick two beats. And in this piece, you can see if we look really closely, we're in 3/4. And so we would count 3 and 1. Okay, and that's all we practice. And we have the Post-it there physically covering up what comes next so we can't go on. And we do this. And when we play through it the first time, we first of all make sure that we counted it correctly and that we use the proper finger numbers. And if we did that, great. Then we can really focus on making sure that we had the correct notes and making sure that we do it as many times as it takes for it to feel easy, okay? And the rule here is you want it to be 95% accurate 95% of the time. And so that means, let's say I'm gonna set out and I'm gonna say, okay, I'm gonna do this 10 times. 9 out of 10 times it has to be done with the correct finger numbers, with the correct notes, with the correct counting, okay? And if you can't do it 9 out of 10 times, you're going too fast, or you take the Post-it and you make it smaller. So maybe I take the Post-it and I actually move it to the left by 1 chord. So I'm really just practicing 3 and I take it even slower, okay? Because if I hold that goal, 95% accurate 95% of the time, it's pretty easy to be honest about if I'm doing it correctly or if I'm not doing it correctly. It's pretty easy to be honest about, okay, do I actually have this? Does it feel easy? Am I doing it 9 out of 10 times correctly? And we don't move on until we achieve those things. And that's a really important part of the Post-it method, because if you put the Post-it there and you play it 10 times, but 5 times you played it correctly and 5 times you played it incorrectly, you're completely wasting your time. It's not going to work because you're sending your brain mixed signals about what you're doing in this chunk of music. You just told your brain that sometimes you play it this way and sometimes you play it this way, and your brain has no way to commit that to memory. Okay, so 9 out of 10 times it has to be the same, meaning it has to be accurate. If you can't play things accurately, don't give up. Don't just get frustrated and say, well, I can't do it. Go slower and make the section even smaller. It would be completely appropriate in the Post-it method to just practice 1. Just that 1 chord. You know, just practice getting your hands in the correct position and playing 1 and then stopping. And then doing it again, 1. That's totally fine. And that's the awesome thing about the Post-it method is there's not really a section of music that's too small, because you can make yourself go down to literally 1 note or 1 chord with the Post-it method, and you can get it. Throughout this learning process, one of the coolest things about the Post-it method is that you can use it to zoom in, like we were talking about just now, where you can really go to 1 beat. You can also use it to zoom out. So let's say, you know, you've done the Post-it method all the way through the piece, beat by beat by beat, and you now have like 2 phrases that you've done that for. You can also then take the Post-its to link up the phrases. So I could take the Post-its and I could just do the last measure of the first phrase into the first measure of the second phrase. So I can work on that transition between the 2 phrases to get things linked up, to get them feeling more musical. And so that's an example of a way that you can kind of zoom out and use the Post-it method to practice larger sections, whether it's a transition or whether it's like, you know, getting 3 phrases to sound smooth together. If you're doing it correctly, and if you're going slow, and if you're using the proper fingering and you're counting out loud, you won't learn anything wrong. And so later you don't have those mistakes to go back and fix. And that's just such a time saver. Okay, so the second example that I gave is that the Post-it method is incredibly useful for troubleshooting. So let's say that you're already learning a piece and you're like, well, crap, I missed my opportunity to start with the Post-it method. That's okay. You're already in it and you can already maybe play through things fairly decently, but you know that there are sections of music where you have trouble. This can also be useful in these spots. Let's say you're playing through a piece and like, you know, there are mistakes that you're making in a section of music, but you're not sure why. Then I would recommend taking your Post-its and taking the section of your music and doing what we were just talking about. So take 2 or 3 beats at a time and just practice those 2 or 3 beats with the proper finger numbers and with the counting out loud. And it's going to help you narrow into exactly where the trouble spot is. It's such a cool thing that happens, because oftentimes when I'm working with people, they can say like, well, I know the second page is just harder. And it seems like I'm always making mistakes on the second page and I'm not sure why. And I'm not really even sure, you know, what mistakes they are. I just know it's really stressful to play the second page and it doesn't sound as good. So take the Post-it method and start using it for the second page and start going through either beat by beat or, you know, a half a measure with a half a measure. If you're already learning your piece, you might be able to do like half measures, potentially full measures, but you're going to want to still stay in those really small sections because it's going to pinpoint exactly where those mistakes are. And so what you can do is when you're using the Post-it method and you're going through beat by beat, start putting circles or stars or start marking in your music where those mistakes are. And when you're done using the Post-it method to go through your page, you're going to have an exact map of where those trouble spots are on the page. And that's really, really valuable because then you can use the Post-it method again to go back and fix those problems. So it's going to give you that clarity of knowing exactly what beat you're making mistakes on, so you can address those problems. Because oftentimes when people say like, oh, the whole second page, it just feels not comfortable. It's just, I know there's a lot of wrong notes, there's a lot of pauses, it's not going well. People will try to practice the whole second page. But because that's a lot of music, and because you already know there's mistakes, you're not focusing in, and you're not really addressing the exact problems. Okay? It'd be like kind of opening up a car hood and being like, well, let's just give everything a wash. You know, you're not really addressing like the specific car issue that you're having. So that's what we want. We want to know, we want to be able to diagnose where that specific issue is, or where the specific issues are, so that we can pinpoint that and fix it for good. Now, the other thing that happens is when I explain this post-it method to people, oftentimes people are like, oh my gosh, this is going to take me years. It's going to take me so much longer to practice this way. But that's not true. And Eleanor, and those of you that have used it, I'd be curious if you can chime in the chat and speak to this, because it goes really fast. The first time you do it, or maybe the first 3 or 4 times you do it, you're learning how to use a new method. And so it will take you a little bit longer, because you're kind of making your brain think in a way that you haven't thought before. But once you do it a couple times, you get really good at asking yourself like, okay, is that accurate? Did I do it 9 times out of 10? Okay, move on. Is it accurate? Can I do it 9 times out of 10? Okay, move on. And you get used to the process of using this method, and it becomes so efficient. Now we're gonna address those problems. So we're gonna take the Post-its, we're gonna find that first circle on page 2, and we're going to hone in on where that is. And maybe you know that it's happening between 3 beats or so. So you're gonna do exactly what we did in the learning stages. You're gonna start with 1 beat, or half a beat, or a fourth of a beat, depending on how many notes are in your music. And you're gonna just play that. And you are going to work for 95% accuracy, 95% of the time. Now, the one thing that is a little bit different at this stage is if you are in the stage of learning where you have already practiced mistakes. You've already played this mistake many times because you know the piece mostly, but there's just wrong notes and pauses happening everywhere. You're gonna need more repetitions of doing it correctly. Something that I learned a long time ago, and I don't remember which book it came from. It was either from The Inner Game of Music, or it was from a book called Musicophilia by Oliver Sacks. I read them around the same time. But for every mistake that you make, it takes 9 times of playing the same thing correctly to cancel out that one wrong mistake. So when we are at this stage of learning and we already have learned the piece, but we know that we've played this part wrong like half the time that we've played it, it's just gonna take more repetitions. And so that's going to be your work here. When you are trying to fix problems that are already practiced into your playing, I would say instead of 10 repetitions, you might go for 30. And that might not be in one sitting. This might be a situation where, if you've practiced this into your piece the wrong way, you might need to use this Post-it method many days in a row for a couple of weeks. And that's okay. You will, if you're doing it correctly, you will reach a day one time, there will be a day where all of a sudden you're like, yes, I can do it. The mistake is gone. I'm not tempted to make that mistake anymore. It is now in my memory the correct way. And that, of course, is our goal. But we have to go slow, go small, 95% accuracy, many, many, many times in a row. And another good check-in you can use is does it feel easy? Okay, that's another way you can check in. So if it's 95% accurate 95% of the time, that's a great way to know you might be ready to move on. But the second question is does it feel easy to play it 95% accurately 95% of the time? And if the answer is yes, great, move your Post-it 1 more note. If the answer is no, maybe do a few more repetitions and then ask yourself that same question again. Some of the things that you can fix, and this is just some of them. This is what I could come up with in 4 seconds. So you can fix wrong notes, you can fix rhythm issues, you can fix fingering problems, you can fix hand position changes, you can fix pauses in your playing. That's just a small list of the things that you can fix using the Post-it method. The Post-it method can also be used at the stage where you're okay, now I really want to refine the piece, and you're ready to add dynamics. And you know the notes and you know the rhythm, but it's not feeling very musical, then you can assign dynamic numbers to your piece, which if you're in my Facebook group and you've done any of the challenges, you know about dynamic numbers. If not, you can join using the link below. I also have a video about dynamic numbers that I can link in the description below, but you could assign dynamic numbers and then you could use the Post-it method, a few notes at a time to really focus in and work on those dynamic numbers and to practice in the dynamics and the musicality and the phrasing and all of that. You can also use the post-it method to work on large jumps, and it's a great way to work on large jumps. So let's say you have like a really jumpy left hand, maybe you're playing like an octave and then you have to jump up to a chord. Use the post-it method to isolate those jumps and just go from the octave to the chord, octave to the chord, octave to the chord. And then once that's easy, go from the chord back down to the octave, chord back down to the octave. I use this often like in any Chopin piece or any Beethoven sonata, like where the left hand is just doing a lot. You can use it for Alberti bass patterns. You can use it for anything complicated, but especially large jumps. It can be really helpful to help you isolate those jumps. And it forces you to focus and to go slow and to learn those distances so you get more confident. It can be really helpful for chord changes. If you have a piece where there's a lot of chords and you're struggling, to get from one chord to the next chord, or there's sections where you're struggling with that, isolate them and use the post-it method. It can really help you change those chord positions. This is kind of a funny one and a creative one, but I've used the post-it method to practice page turns before, because if you are in a situation where you are learning a piece that has a page turn, and every time you get to the page turn, you have like that long pause where you have to like stop and take your hands off the piano and turn the page and then find your new hand position. You're practicing that into your memory. You're teaching your ear that when you get to that point of music, you have a big long pause. You're teaching your hands that when you get to that point in the music, they go off the keyboard and they come up to the page and then they have to refine their hand position. And so when it comes to page turns, we want them to be as fast and seamless as possible. So take the last measure on the page and the first measure on the next page, and use the post-it to help yourself practice that page turn so that you get faster at it, and so that you start to learn like really what is that transition. So that it's almost like you're memorizing the last measure of the page and the first measure of the page so that the page turn is less of a big deal. We touched on this a little bit. You can use it for linking up sections of music. So this can be done at the beginning, or if you're already in the stage of a piece where you've learned it and you're like, I have the third page down, but the transition into the fourth page is really challenging. Use the post-it method to address specifically those transitions and link things up. It's very, very useful for that. And then one of my other favorite ways to use this is for rhythm transitions. Any piece of music where there's a rhythm transition where you're going from like 16th notes to quarter notes, or quarter notes to eighth notes, or eighth notes to triplets. Anytime there's a tricky rhythm transition, you can use the post-it method first from a rhythmic stance. So use the post-it method to cover up your music, and you can actually just tap and count out loud to help yourself really feel the rhythm transition and get it into your like internal pulse. And then you can also use the post-it method to then practice actually playing through those rhythm transitions so that you are just significantly more confident and comfortable changing note values or changing tempos or changing, with those rhythm transitions. All right, now I've touched on some of this, but I just want to give you this disclaimer, because with any of the revolutionary practice methods that I talk about on the channel, but especially with the post-it method, it will not work if you try to rush through it. Okay, so if you put the post-its on your music, but you go back to your old tricks and you're trying to play things fast and you're not focusing on 95% accurate 95% of the time, it's not going to work. And it can actually make things a little bit worse, because if you are practicing in this focused way where you're zoomed in on these notes, but you're practicing it wrong, you're really just reinforcing the mistakes and practicing the mistakes into your memory. So we always want to keep in mind that ratio of playing accurately way more than we're playing inaccurately. And in fact, one of the things that I have talked about before on the channel that I have people do sometimes is actually keep a little tally chart. This can bring another level of organization to it. If you can't keep track, or if you're struggling to keep track, make a tally chart. And every single time you do it, mark the column that it's correct or incorrect. And you'll have a very clear, literal picture of how often you're playing it correctly and how often you're playing it incorrectly. Because for every tally that you have in the incorrect side, you should have 9 on the correct side. Okay? And we always want to keep that ratio. It won't work if you don't keep that ratio. It's also not going to work, like we mentioned at the beginning of the live stream, if you're not clear on the rhythm. If you're not counting out loud, it's not going to work. Or at least really internally counting and telling yourself what beat you're on in the measure. We talked about this already a little bit, but especially if you're working like, only on 2 beats of the measure, or you're starting in the middle of a measure, if you do that, you might have success. Like you might be able to play those 2 beats in the middle of the measure correctly, but then when you take the post-its away, your brain has no idea how to fit those 2 beats that you just learned into the context of that section of music. So you have to be counting. And same with fingering. If you're not using consistent fingering, and this is a general rule always, regardless of if you're using the post-it method or not. If you're not using consistent fingering, you're giving your brain mixed signals, and there's no way for your brain to commit to memory what you're asking it to do. So make sure that you have that consistent fingering, or it won't work. Go slow. You can always slow it down, okay? Always. You can always slow it down. You can always break it down. You can always do smaller sections, one hand at a time, and always focus on accuracy. Use that 95% rule. Write it out at the top of your piece of music if you have to, so that you are always checking in and asking yourself that question. Is it 95% accurate 95% of the time? And does it feel easy to do that? If you're not already part of the Facebook group, make sure you join that.